Hello and welcome to this presentation where we will see how to add additional security feature to PowerServer using a tool called Visual Guard. A word about our company. We are Novalis and we provide tools for Power Builder and .NET for a long time. Among them, there's Visual Guard that we will see now to add modern authentication, authorization, audit features, and other security to your application. Visual Expert is presented in a separate session and is used for cross-references, documentation, code inspection, and in this other session, it's presented to detect security vulnerabilities in your Power Builder application. And there's a number of additional companion tools that we provide on top of Power Builder. About the context and today's agenda. When you move to the cloud with PowerServer, you may evolve your security and implement what is called modern authentication. This presentation will explain first what modern authentication is, which security features are provided with the Power Builder built-in security, how to go further with Visual Guard to add, for example, single sign-on, fine-grained authorization, audit, etc. And most important, how to implement this feature without coding. So what is modern authentication? It's part of identity and access management that is usually called also access control or role-based access control, but that's also including other specific features to secure the identity of the user and make sure he's only accessing what is allowed to access in your system. It's combining modern methods of authentication and authorization with different keywords and technology you probably heard of, tokens, single sign-on, OAuth 2.0, multi-factor authentication, etc. We will talk about that today. And it's more secure than basic authentication and widely adopted by recent standard and key players, Microsoft, Google, but most of the players and most of the technology now are evolving toward this modern authentication. And sooner or later, you may have to implement it as well to either deploy on the cloud or simply to comply with corporate standard or industry standards. How is modern authentication working in the case of a PowerServer application? So you have the Power Builder application running on the client side, and at the backend side, you have the Web API and the logic you've been deploying in the cloud, running with PowerServer, and of course, there's also the application database. When the user is logging in the application, in most cases with the Power Builder application, it would be logging with a username password in the logging form. At this point, his identity is sent to an identity server who's in charge of verifying the ID. It returns a token that is essentially a data container. So it's containing different type of information. Each data or each set of information is called a claim. So you would have, for example, the username, his first name, last name. You can have a set of authorization or the role he has, or depending on the application and your requirement, you may choose to include more or less information in the token. And this information will be required later on for security reasons. That's what we're going to see. During the session, the token is stored on the client side, and every time client is accessing the Web API to access some resources, whether you want to execute a web service or get some data via the Web API. So every time the client will pass the token, that will be used, among other things, to authenticate the token and make sure that he is authorized to use the Web API. And that is going to be used with two modules. There's usually an authentication module, and that's the one who's supposed to authenticate the user, verify his identity. And there is an authorization module that you can use to develop fine-grained permissions. Then you will be able to define which resource can be accessed by which user. In the context of modern authentication, there is a key component called the identity server. As we mentioned, That's the component who's supposed to authenticate the user, generate the token, provide its authorization later on, etc. PowerServer includes a built-in identity server that will essentially authenticate the user and also provides templates to integrate with Amazon Cognito and Azure Active Directory if you chose to use those two identity servers. Visual Guard that we are using today also includes an identity server that is specifically designed for PowerBuilder and PowerServer application. It provides additional advanced features like single sign-on, fine-grained authorization audit. We will see that a bit later. And as we mentioned briefly, it does not require any coding for implementing this feature and integrating the security into your application. So you have several options. You can use the PowerServer built-in identity server mainly for authentication purposes. You can also use third-party authentication servers that are available on the market like Okta, that is getting quite popular these days. And you can use Visual Guard that is providing all those advanced features but without any coding. So first of all, we'll see how these features are working when they are implemented in a PowerBuilder PowerServer application. And then I will show you how to quickly set up the system and integrate Visual Guard with your application in a few minutes. A word about the runtime architecture. Let's go step by step from authentication to audit. For starter, we have the traditional PowerBuilder client, the user, and then on the back end, you have PowerServer 2021 with the REST API, runtime services, database provider, and the application database. Step 1, the user logs in the PowerBuilder client application, as usual with modern authentication. But with Visual Guard, you can choose to modernize the client authentication method. Of course, you still have the traditional login password if you want to keep using it. You can also enable Windows authentication with or without single sign-on if you like, which means the user will run the application without even logging in any form. It's going to run silently by checking in the background the Windows account used by the user and applying the proper permission to this particular user. You can also use a web single sign-on system, which means you will log with an account once, and you can jump from your PowerServer application to another web application or any other web client secured by Visual Guard. The last example I will mention today, but there are even additional authentication methods if you need, is multi-factor authentication. You know, that's the kind of highly secure authentication where you have to provide, for example, a code, but also a fingerprint, or you would use a mobile phone to confirm your identity. That type of highly secured authentication method. Number 2, as usual, the authentication request is sent to the identity server, in our case, the Visual Guard identity server, and he's the one who should verify the identity of the user. If this is verified, then it will return a security token to the client. But this time, it will be enriched with all the authorizations of the user that we will leverage later on. Step 4, the client is running, and from time to time, it sends a request to access server resources. A Visual Guard component running in PowerServer 2021 will intercept this request, verify if the token is valid, verify that this user can access the Web API, that's the authentication part, and verify that this particular user can access all the resources requested to display a list of product or to show a purchase order, etc., which behind the scene implies accessing one or several data windows, and it will also verify that he has the permission for this type of access. Someone can access the product to read them, but other people may have also the permission to create or delete from this particular resource. This is all done by the authorization module provided by Visual Guard. If all authorizations are OK, then the request will execute as expected. At any point in time, administrators can use a ready-to-use admin UI that we provide and that we will see later on. for several reasons. Number one, to manage user account, whether it's login password or Windows account coming from Active Directory. They will be able to define authorizations and grant them to user or groups of user. There is a lot to discuss about authorization, and we will mention that a bit later. And it will also be able to monitor and audit security. Again, a number of features that we will see a bit later. So let's start by modernizing the user authentication on the client side. And typically, for instance, we want to replace a login password with a user table in the database with Windows Authentication, SSO, etc. So step by step, first, we will see how to declare Windows account with the Visual Guard console and give them access right to one or several applications. Then from the user perspective, we will see how that's working when they log in with the Windows Authentication. Then we'll move to the next step and enable Windows SSO. And then we'll see how that's working from the user perspective as well. So I'm opening here a Visual Guard console. This is a Windows desktop application, and there's also a web version of this console that I will show you side by side. You can choose to use the Windows version or the web version depending on your requirement. First of all, I have to log in with a privileged account, and I access this user interface where I can see several applications secured by Visual Guard, because you can centralize the security of several technologies and or applications. And this is where I would find the users already declared in my application. Now, if I want to declare a new Windows account and give him access right, I would go here. This is for declaring an existing account in my Active Directory, but I can even create a new Windows account or a new Windows group. And that depends, of course, on the privilege that I have to either read or write in the Active Directory. And also, we're not only talking about one Active Directory, but that could be accessing multiple Active Directories in one or several domains, Windows domains. As long as they're in the same forest, it doesn't matter how many Active Directories and domains you need to manage. And I have this window opening that allows me to search for one or several Windows accounts in the Active Directories that I can access. You may notice here that it's not only for user account, but also possibly Windows groups. And why would I like to include Windows group here? Simply because instead of granting access right at Windows user level, you could grant access right for an entire Windows group, which means that in the future, no matter who's entering or leaving this group, that's for the Windows administrator to figure out, or the HR or the help desk. But you're only responsible for your application and the access right that you give to this Windows group, period. And you delegate the daily management of user coming in and out to the person in charge of Active Directory or in charge of the personnel. So I will search for my Windows account. I would add it, and I get this window where I can see the applications that are currently declared in my Visual Guard repository, Angular, PowerBuilder, .NET, etc. And on the right-hand side, for each application, I see that there is already below each application a default role. So that's a feature that you can use and that each application owner can leverage to define the default permission anytime we create a new user. It can be nothing, or it can be a minimum access that you want to give by default to any new user. But in my case, I would remove the default role for this application that we use now. You know, that's the sales demo application provided with PowerBuilder. And instead, I will give a role with full privilege. Once I'm done, I just validate, and the user account is now listed with the other user in my repository. This is, like I said, the Windows desktop version of the administration console. Let's take a look at the web version. They are both connected to the same Visual Guard repository that is, in this case, hosted in the cloud. So I can concurrently access with both Windows web consoles and from any location, as long as I have the right to connect to this Visual Guard repository. By default, I have a dashboard that we will come back to this later. And if I take a look at the user, this is the account I just created with the desktop version. And if I take a look at the roles, I can see that for the API on sales demo, I do have the role admin. Now that's how to integrate with Active Directory, get Windows account, and give them access right. What does it look like from the user perspective? For now, I will just log in by providing my Windows credential. And so let's start the PowerServer application. It will update the app runner and the code possibly. And when the logging window pops up, instead of entering a classic username password, I can enter my Windows account and password, and then log in the application. Again, this is the sales demo provided with PowerBuilder. And you can see in the title bar that we added for information the name of the user, in this case, my Windows account, and the role that I'm currently connected with. Now let's see how to move forward, and instead of asking the user to enter his Windows credential, we'll see how to enable single sign-on. So to do that, I will edit the open event of the application object. And you can see here that I've, on purpose, I left two versions of the code for logging. This is the default code to use the logging form. And instead, I will comment this one and uncomment this one. And as you can see, we will call a couple methods to check if the current Windows user is authorized to enter the application. And if so, the application will open silently without requesting any credentials. So now that I'm done, I will save, generate the code, deploy again, and let's see what's happening when the user is running the application. So basically, it doesn't see any logging form, but again, we see that I'm connected with the same Windows account and role. So it only took a couple lines of code. And of course, before that, we had to integrate to plug Visual Guard with your application and with PowerServer. And I will show you at the end of this presentation how to do that. There's a few steps and a few lines of code that you copy and paste, but that's quite simple. It usually takes less than 1 hour, and our support team is doing that with you if you like, with a remote session. Now let's see how to manage authorization, and more precisely fine-grained authorization to restrict access to some specific data or feature or control in your application. I will use this schema to explain quickly the kind of challenges we are facing. In particular, we will see a few examples of fine-grained authorization, for example, filtering data on the client side or hiding controls. We will see how to create dynamically new authorization without touching the code, only using the console and creating the new authorization in the repository. Then we'll see how to manage large volumes of user and authorization, which is always quite a challenge for a large system. And finally, we'll use the console again to see how we can either document or audit and review existing authorization in case of a security review, for example. So let's start by viewing a few examples of fine-grained authorization that we can create on top of whatever existing security system you would have, because in most cases, popular applications already have some security in place where, in particular, you can control the menu and change the menu options from one user to another depending on his role, for example. So what we're going to see here is coming on top of this if you want to add additional fine-grained restrictions. So I'm going to run twice the same application we used so far. Once with an unrestricted user with an admin role, and then with a restricted user called John Smith with a restricted role that you can see in the title bar if I put them side by side. This user can view and manipulate orders. For example, you can see order coming from different countries and you can edit the details of the order because it has the corresponding authorization. Whereas this guy can see orders, so he's still accessing the same application and window and data window, but you can see that the data is filtered by territory. That would be the case of a salesperson that can see customers and purchase order coming from his territory, but that should not see the same data from another territory. And also, let's say that this guy can view the information, but is not authorized to change or edit them for some security reason. That's why this tab here has been hidden. Now let's see how we can create this type of permission on the UI and also on the backend side using the console. For this new permission, let's say that in the Windows product, I would like to hide this detailed tab page as it was already hidden for the order window. Let's see how this goes. I will open the console. So this is the sales application. In this node, you will see the permission that are grouped by business entity. And if I want to add a new permission for product, there's already a number of permissions allowing to create, delete, read, update product. So I will create a new permission to hide the detailed tab. So I will add a technical action for Visual Guard to dynamically change the properties of the control inside the window. So I will open the window product, and inside the window I see the tab folder with two tab pages. This is the detailed information tab page that I would like to hide. And the permission goes like this. I would say that when this window opens, Visual Guard will send an order to this tab page and hide itself. And there could be a number of other actions to disable, enable, set filters. There's a number of actions that you can set dynamically for any PowerBuilder control that you would like to control in the UI. Anyway, that's it. This permission is created. Now I need to grant the permission to my user via a role. And in this application, there is a number of roles already created. The user John Smith was using this one. So I would just take this permission and place it in the role. Now, the next time I will be running this application, I should see the impact of this new permission. If I log again with John Smith, and I go to the window product, now the tab page is no longer visible because it has been dynamically hidden by the Visual Guard component loaded in the application on the client side, and that has been retrieving the permission and applying the permission dynamically without touching the code. Let's go back to the console and see how we defined a couple additional permissions. So this is the one we created before. You may remember that when we had the list of order, in some cases they were filtered by territory. And this is another example of permission dynamically applied. It goes like this. So when this window opens, we send an order to this particular object. You see there's a user object with a tab folder, a tab page, and a data window control. And this data window control execute an action called set filter with the column territory ID equal to 7, which is a reference table, and territory ID equals 7 means France. We are dynamically setting a filter on this data window, and we filter the column country to display only the rows where the territory is France. And you can go like that on any control on the UI side to enable, disable. For the data window, you can hide column, you can dynamically change a where clause. There's a lot you can do to manipulate the UI on top of the existing security that is already implemented. What about the Web API? What about the backend? You can also define authorization to access either certain data windows, read, write, permissions like that. But you can also set the permission on the backend at resource level. In most cases, a resource would be a table or a business entity, if you like. So first of all, what you would do is once you plug the visual guard in your application, you would load all the components of the Power Builder application, and Visual Guard with the libraries embedded on the client side will browse the code, extract a description of the object on one hand, and then you would map the client side with the backend side. This will create some dependencies and automatically generate authorizations. And for example, for product, we have defined an authorization to update. And it means in that case that the user is authorized to update the table product. This is at resource level, but if you want to define a finer grain, you can do that object by object. And if I display only the object which are authorized here, you can see that sometime I can update, create, read for certain data window object. So you can define this mapping between data window object and resources in order to grant permission at resource level or at object level, as you like. Once this is done, you have defined permission both on the client and the backend. Now, let's say that you start with a migration of your Power Builder application to PowerServer. This will create a Web API, and after that, you will extend the Web API with additional services on the back end, and you will expose this Web API not only to your current Power Builder client, but possibly to additional applications in different technologies, Power Builder, Angular, you name it. This will make the authorization at the Web API level critical. And this is when, in particular, you want to define for each resource behind the backend who is authorized to access which resource and in which way. Now, let's see how to manage authorization for a large system. And actually, there are two cases. First case, I may have a very large volume of authorization, possibly coming from several applications. And second case, I may have a large volume of user. I may also have a combination of both. First, let's see how to deal with a large volume of permissions. So far, we added a permission and simply drag and dropped the permission into a role. That's nice if the role includes a small volume of permission. But what if there is a very large volume of permission? In that case, what I would do is I would use permission sets to group permissions. You see, this is a list of permission sets. This permission set is including several permissions to allow editing customers and addresses. If I see what's behind, you see there's a bunch of permission. There's no limit as to how many permission I could place here. And what I could do in that case is take this permission set and grant it to a role. That's fine. But if I need to go further, I can even place a permission set inside another permission set and create like that a hierarchy of permission set. And at the top, I will have the role. And at the bottom of this hierarchy, I will have all the permissions. Last comment about this, as you can see, we can here manage permissions not only for one application, but for several applications, which means if I have a large number of applications, each of them including a large volume of permission, I would be able to define this hierarchy of role, permission set, and permissions. And also for one user, I will be able to grant roles for several applications. So that's the first case. Now, for the second case, let's imagine we have a very large number of users. And by the way, we should try to use the web console for a change. So for now, we've been using the Windows version of the Visual Guard console. Let's take the web version. If I have a large volume of users, What I want to do is define user groups, and not only a list of groups, but rather a hierarchy of groups. We do recommend, as a good practice, to replicate the structure of your organization. That will be easier later on to manage user. Let me show you why. This is a fake example. So I have at the first level some divisions. In each division, I have department. And for each department, I have positions, jobs. And that's the same for division 2, division 3, etc. By replicating like that the structure of my organization, I can then, for each level of group, assign the corresponding roles. And if I have granted roles at multiple levels, I will have here all the permissions that are transversal to this division. Then anyone in this department would be granted certain other roles, etc., etc. So it's like a cascading system where I can refine step by step the authorization related to each level of the hierarchy. Now, on a daily basis, what I would do is simply add a user, place him in the group hierarchy, and that's it. It will get all the roles of this group. Let me show you an example. I've been using this JSmith user before, and we did grant him the role restricted for this application. So now we're going to remove this role. And for now, he's no longer able to access the application. He has no permission whatsoever. He cannot enter the demo application. So let's pretend this is a new user. He was just created today. And I'm the administrator in charge of the daily administration. Maybe I'm the help desk or HR, or I'm a business manager in charge of my business unit. What I would do is just take this user and place him in the group corresponding to his position in our organization. So he is belonging to this division, this department, and he's an employee. That's all. This is the only thing I have to do to grant him access to all the applications in my organization. Because while doing that, I gave him access to all the roles granted to this group. For now, there's no role, so let's add one role for our demo application. Okay. Now, anybody placed in this group will automatically get this role. Now, let's give it a try. If I run the demo application again, and I connect with our JSmith user, then I'm logged automatically as we did before with this account and the role granted to the group of the user. So by following this strategy of user group on a daily basis with a large volume of user, system administrator will only have to assign new users to the proper groups. That can even be several groups if needed. And that's it. Automatically, they will get access to all the applications they need and all the features they need. Now, let's say that we have a system in place with lots of users, lots of permissions and applications. Then we need to either document or audit the security to make sure everything's right, or from time to time to review some specific part of the security, for example, for a set of users or for one application. Let's take this example. We take the same user and we would like to know more about his permissions. We can simply click here and we have a list of all the permissions that are currently granted to the user. And for each permission, we can take a look and see where this permission is coming from. It tells me that this permission that we created was placed in the role, and this role was granted to a group of employees, and the user belongs to this group. This is how he gets the permission, via a group and a role. And I can also view the permission under a different angle. If I were to, let's say, check a particular role, same story, I can select the role and, for example, audit is permission like that. This is the list of permissions that are currently granted to the role, but if you remember, we may have a hierarchy of permission set, so I may wonder where this permission is coming from. If I click here, it tells me that the permission is coming from permission set that is granted to the role. And if I would have a hierarchy of several levels of permission set, that would also display here. So this is how I understand which permission is granted to which user, role, application, etc., and where it's coming from. Now, if I want to go further, let's say that I need to export this data, generate a report to review or document the current security for a set of users. I can select a few of them, and I have a specific action here that consists in generating an Excel file, a permission matrix. There is a wizard opening where I can select a number of parameters to include more or less details and pick the applications I'm interested in, either all of them or just some of them. That would generate an Excel that I can save, open, and review. I can take our popular application, and this is what I get. Tells me that, for example, this GSmith user we've been using so far has a number of permissions here. You see, that's the one we created and granted before. And it also has the role called restricted role, whereas admin has another role. And that's for just one small volume. It can work with a much larger volume to document and keep track of who gets the right to do what in your application. Let's see how to perform a security audit, monitor sensitive activities, and trigger an alert whenever needed. Visual Guard can log important events of different categories. Number one, security event, particular when somebody tries to log in the application. Number two, security administration related event, when you create an account, grant a role, associate permission set to a certain role, place them in a group, etc., just to keep track of what was done to administrate the security. And number three, and probably the most important one, business event. If you want to keep track of an important wire transfer or drug prescriptions or access to personal data of your customers, all these important events will be logged in the Visual Guard repository. You can leverage this information for various purposes. The administrator can use either the desktop or the web version of the Visual Guard console, and it will be able to audit the security under various angles. We saw just one example when it comes to auditing the permission of a particular user, but it will be able to analyze user activity in general. It will be able to generate reports about the access to protected data, financial, personal, medical. Number two, it will be able to monitor the application to follow different type of activities, whether it's the user attendance or sensitive transaction, and even unusual peak of activities. And number three, in case of suspicious activities, you can configure a workflow to detect certain cases and then send an alert where you would gather different information, technical, business, user information, etc., and send it to the proper personnel. Let's see how this goes, and we'll take the example of the web console, but we can do the same with the Windows desktop console. If I want to review the activity of users or administrators, I can do that at different levels: user, application, or the entire security system. If I start at user level, I can edit this user and analyze his activity under different angles. So at first it's just a flat list, but then I can change the criteria to filter with a certain type of event, in that case business event happening in the application, between this date, and possibly restrict to one particular application or all of them. Then I will see that in that case, this user in this time range and with this application, for example, you see change the price of a product. So you have the name of the product, the previous price, and the new price. And that goes on, one by one like this. I can also review other types of event. This is a logon attempt, whether it's successful or not. I can see what has been done when administering the security, where this account was modified, a role was granted, revoked, password was modified, etc. And I can also check out what was done in terms of workflow, whether you create, update a workflow to trigger an alert. That's also something you want to keep track to make sure no one is interfering with this security process. This is at user level, but I can do the same at application level. If I'm coming here, this is the application dashboard, and I can, from here or there, access the event viewer for this particular application. Then again, I have similar filtering possibilities. I can even do that for the entire repository, and this gives me a view across all the applications. Now let's see how I can monitor the security and the activity in my application. Again, this can be done with both Windows and Web Console, and this can be done at user level, application level, and repository level. For the entire repository, I can start here, and I will see several charts. By default, it shows me the attendance hours, which means hour by hour, in average, how many people are logging in successfully or not. That can be used, number one, to see when your server or your system is busy. And also, when you're starting deploying a new version of your application, you can monitor the people accessing successfully to the application if needed. This can be also filtered by date and by application. In this tab, you would have the possibility to create a chart for any event that you would like to place in the chart to see for, I don't know, the volume of business transactions, of purchase order, of wire transfer executed in the application, you name it. And again, filtered by application, day by day, or by months or by hours, and you can also select a range for the dates. Finally, this is a chart about the workflow executed. So if you've been scheduling workflows, you want to make sure that nothing happened, or vice versa, that the workflow notification is going properly. This is at repository level. We can do the same at application level, either by clicking here or here in the application dashboard, and you will get the same graph for attendance hours and historical data. And finally, you have a similar feature at user level. If you edit the user right here, you can see the same charts we talked about before. Now let's see how to configure notification for security or business reasons. Let's take the example of a modification I make in the demo application where I would edit a product and change its list price, for example, like this, make the change. If that's considered as a critical event, I have the possibility to log it and keep a trace of these changes. And at the end, I will get a notification that would look like this. In that case, an email. And if I want to configure this notification, I can use the web console. In that section, you can define workflows. A workflow is a series of steps that would test if certain conditions are met and then trigger certain actions. Let's take a look at this particular workflow that I just used. It's called price change notification. It's very simple, just very basic. If we trigger the event number 1000 where we save a change of the price for a product, if we trigger this event, then we send an email that is configured right here with a certain template. And that's the end of the process. And I can add more or less steps In this process, we have different nodes, to test certain conditions, send an email, get user assigned roles, etc., etc. So those are actions or nodes that you can add in your workflow if needed. Then you can add several workflows, and you will monitor if workflows are executed right here with similar monitoring charts that we saw before, or use the event viewer to analyze what has been done before, which workflow, executed when, for which reason, etc. So we've been using Visual Guard for modernizing the authentication method, managing fine-grained authorization, and auditing and monitoring the security. Now let's see how to implement the system. There's a few steps, do not require any coding, and more precisely, there's no development whatsoever. You just have to install and configure a few components and add a few lines of configuration that I'm going to present right now. So we start with an existing PowerBuilder client and PowerServer Web API that we need to secure. We have to install first the Visual Guard admin console. It's a simple setup with a few steps. Next, 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 and we are done. Then we'll see how to create a repository with the console, how to install and configure the Visual Guard Identity Server and connect it to the repository. Then we'll see how to configure the PowerBuilder client application by including a few libraries, the Visual Guard runtime, and establishing the relationship between this application and Visual Guard on one hand, and also configure it properly to communicate with the Web API secured by Visual Guard as well. And in the Web API, there is also a Visual Guard component that we will include in the solution and configure properly. So step one, we install the console with a simple setup, run the console, and create a new repository. Then a new wizard opens. Here we choose to create a new repository, select the type of database, SQL Server, and enter the connection settings to access the SQL Server instance we will use here. And once connected, we can select a database inside this instance, sales demo in our case. Then we can choose to implement by default one or several authentication modes. Let's pick the 3 of them for now. We can add even more later on. And then we can configure the default administrator account to access the rest of the repository, and the creation process is started. And now it's completed. The repository is ready. We can connect. Then I will use the master administrator we configured, which is actually my Windows account. So we just completed step 1 and 2 to install the console and create the repository. Now we move to step 3. We install the identity server, which is again a very basic setup that will copy the corresponding files under IIS. So you can also deploy to Active Directory Azure if you like. And as soon as the setup is completed, the web page is opening automatically to configure the Visual Guard identity server and connect it to the repository. This is again quite simple because it's only a matter of connecting the Visual Guard identity server to the repository. So we select the database type, then enter the connection details, like we did with the Windows console. Then we test the connection, and if that's successful, then just complete and save the settings. And that's it. Our repository is configured. Step number 4, I will now configure the client application. I will include the libraries provided with Visual Guard in the PowerBuilder application and configure it to let Visual Guard manage authentication, authorization, audit, etc. And I will also configure the relationship between the client application and the repository to see this PowerBuilder application with the console and scan the code to define authorization as we did during our demonstration. So this is our PowerBuilder application. You can see that we've been adding a few libraries provided with Visual Guard at the end of this library list. Now I will modify the open event of the application object as we showed briefly before to enable the authentication by Visual Guard with different type, single sign-on, logging form, whatever you need. And I will also modify the ancestor window and more precisely the open event where I will add this standard line of code to let Visual Guard manage the security anytime I'm opening a new window in my application. Now I'm back in the Win console where I will declare the PowerBuilder client application in order to define later on roles and permission for this application and grant them to users. It goes like this. I can select the type of application I want to secure. In our case, it's going to be a PowerBuilder application. I would select the target, a couple settings. I give a name to this application. Now I have a couple settings to establish the relationship with the future API. This is where I can select the claims, the data that will be passed with the token from the client to the API, and that Visual Guard will leverage to apply permissions, authorizations if you like, manage the authentication, etc. For example, we will get the role of the user, some attribute with his profile, his list of permissions, etc. So let's pick a bit of everything. A couple additional tab pages, and this is where I will define the secret key that should be passed from the client application to the Web API to make sure that only this client application can access the Web API. I can type any secret phrase or generate it automatically with a possible expiration date if needed. And that's it. I can then save and my application is now configured. Step number 5, the final one. We will configure the Web API to include the Visual Guard assemblies, to use the Visual Guard module for authentication purposes, to intercept requests coming from the client, check the authorization, and by doing so, to use the Visual Guard authentication module in PowerServer. So let's see how to do that. So in the PowerBuilder IDE, you probably already declared a PowerServer project to prepare the deployment of the Web API and the creation of a C# solution on the backend. In this configuration, we will include here the Visual Guard assemblies, and also right here, we'll give a name to the solution and mention, as usual, the Web API URL. Then we generate and deploy the code. And in the solution that is generated automatically, we will adjust some settings as well. So number one, you will include the Visual Guard assembly right here in the dependencies that will be included in the solution. Then the appconfig.json, this is the configuration setting for the Web API you've been developing. We will adjust here the settings by including this configuration. It's a copy and paste from the Visual Guard documentation, except for here the URL of your identity server that may, of course, be depending on your configuration. This is for configuring the application on the backend side. And now for PowerServer itself, when PowerServer is starting, you adjust the startup.cs. Number one, to replace the authentication service provided by default by PowerServer and replace it with the Visual Guard Authentication and Authorization module. And also, later on here, you will add the Visual Guard middleware. This is the assembly that will intercept the queries coming from the client and process them with the authorization module to make sure that the user is indeed authorized to execute this request and access the resources behind the request hosted in the API. So that's it. Our system is now entirely configured. So it took us about 10 minutes during this presentation, but it's more like 1 hour in the real life. And of course, at any point in time, if you need some assistance, our support team will be there to guide you with remote sessions if needed. And from now on, you can develop your application as usual and deploy the client and the web API. The configuration will remain and will be properly secured. And then you will be able to leverage all the features we saw before to manage authentication, authorization, and auditing features. You can try it with your code, whether it's a PowerBuilder client-server only application or a PowerBuilder plus PowerServer web API. And there are two ways to do that. You can install and configure a copy on-premise, or you can connect to our hosted environment, in which case it's already pre-configured, repository, identity server, admin console, etc. You just have to plug Visual Guard in your application, deploy, and get started with your security. We still have a few minutes left. In case there are some questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And in any case, I thank you very much for your attention today. Any questions?